people a chance to log into Zoom, and then we will get started. Thanks for your patience. All right, I'm cognizant that we have only an hour and more folks will trickle in over the next few minutes, but we can get started. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for this webinar, Comparing Economic Engagement, Taiwan and China in Central and Eastern Europe. I'm Pam Kennedy, a research analyst with the East Asia program at the Stimson Center in Washington. And it's my great pleasure today to welcome the authors of 2 chapters in a forthcoming report. Dr. Agnes Sunomar is the head of research group on development economics at the Institute of World Economics Center for Economic and Regional Studies. And today she will be discussing her paper on China and Taiwan's economic and political engagement in Central and Eastern Europe. We're also joined by Dr. Quancheng Huang, who is a professor in the Department of Transportation and Logistics Management at National Yangming Chiao Tung University in Taiwan. And he'll be discussing his research on Taiwan's foreign investments in the high-tech sector, especially electronics manufacturing services. And finally, we're very honored to be joined by Dr. Gregory Kuta, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Diplomacy and International Relations at Tamkang University in Taiwan, for his commentary on these 2 papers. So since we have 1 hour, I will ask Dr. Sunomar and Huang to share their insights with us from their research, and then Dr. Kuta for his commentary, and then we will open up to audience question and answers. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A function. Please click on it and you can send in your question to the panelists, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. With that, Dr. Sunomar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning or good evening, depending on joining from. I'm sharing my screen in a minute and try to be as fast as some valuable time for comments. So my role was basically to cover Chinese and Taiwanese economic footprint and the potential political consequences of that in the case of Central. So basically, I try to analyze economic relations and their possible effects on the political terrain of the relations between China, Taiwan, and Central and Eastern Europe. And I decided to focus on just 3 countries, that's Czechia, Hungary, and Poland, because these 3 countries are the major trading partners of both China and Taiwan, as well as the major hosts of investment from both countries. I was focusing not only on the possible effects of economic relations on the political terrain, but also the effects of political relations on the economic terrain. So basically, I analyzed both perspectives. I started with trade relations. I'm going to show you a graph, but I don't want to speak about this too long because I think that the FDI, so the foreign direct investment topic was. But still, as you can see on this graph, when comparing Central and Eastern Europe's trade with Poland, Central and Eastern Europe is the largest recipient of both Chinese and Taiwanese imports, followed by Czechia and Hungary. On the export side, it is again Poland, followed by Czechia, most to China, but Czechia exports the most to Taiwan, followed by Poland and Hungary. Trade between Central and Eastern Europe and China indeed increased substantially in the past, let's say, 20 years. Both the European Union membership as well as the launch of the so-called 16+1 initiative gave new impetus to these relations. The 16+1 initiative is a forum for China to meet all the Central and Eastern European countries. And it is also important to note, but you can also see it on the graph, that there's a huge difference when it comes to Chinese CEE trade between imports and exports, and resultantly the trade deficit is huge as well. But as I've mentioned, the FDI is a far more interesting story, especially because both Chinese and Taiwanese companies arrived to Central and Eastern Europe at the very same time. Smaller companies arrived in the early 90s, and the big ones, multinational companies, arrived in the early 2000s, mainly because of the same reason. As Central and Eastern European countries became EU member states, they became even more attractive for multinational enterprises. As you can see, the major host of both Chinese as well as Taiwanese FDI is Hungary, which is interesting, especially considering the fact that Hungary is a big friend of China. We can say that this is the biggest fan or the biggest supporter of China within the European Union, and also within the Central and Eastern European region, which also, of course, means that the relationship between Taiwan or Taipei and Budapest is relatively cold. Yet the big Taiwanese multinational enterprises tend to choose Hungary over the far more friendly Czechia or Poland. The numbers of companies, this is indicated with gray and black bullets, show a somewhat opposite trend. The number of Chinese companies is highest in Poland, followed by Hungary and Czechia, while the number of Taiwanese companies is the highest in Czechia, followed by Poland and Hungary. That is, Hungary has the highest stock of FDI from both China and Taiwan, while it hosts only a third as many and a quarter as many Taiwanese companies as the Czech Republic. The explanation is relatively simple. Hungary hosts mainly big multinational enterprises from both China and Taiwan, with each of these investments having a relatively high value, while Poland and Czechia host mainly smaller companies. It has to be emphasized, though, that Chinese investments are still dwarfed by, for instance, German investments, so the numbers are relatively high. Of course, Chinese investments are higher than Taiwanese ones, but still, when we compare them to, for example, investments from Germany, France, or even Japan, these are smaller in numbers. Since I made a lot of interviews with experts, company officials, I tried to find out those factors, or what could be those factors that attract Taiwanese and Chinese companies to Central and Eastern Europe. Here, I differentiated between three types of so-called pull factors: macroeconomic, institutional, and political. And based on the interviews, Chinese and Taiwanese companies seem to be attracted mainly by macroeconomic factors. These factors are, among others, market access, but not just to Central and Eastern Europe, but the whole EU market, low factor costs, mainly labor costs, of course, as well as the qualification of the labor force and company level relations. Nevertheless, institutional factors such as free trade agreements, institutional stability, tax and other type of incentives are also important for both Chinese and Taiwanese companies when locating in Central and Eastern Europe. But we can also mention political factors, such as the level of political relations or political gestures or confidence building measures, although these were important mainly for Chinese companies. So when answering the questions of the research, based on the interview results, mainly we can say that Chinese companies tend to invest in more politically friendly countries, while investing less in countries that make critical statements about China from time to time, which means that political relations or diplomatic relations indeed affect economic interactions, but it seems that economic relations do not really have any impact on political ties. That is, more Chinese investment doesn't necessarily result in better political relations between China and the respective Central and Eastern European countries. Political or diplomatic relations in Central and Eastern Europe with China seem to be much more influenced by international trends, mainly by EU-level processes, but also the US stance. Probably Hungary seems to be an exception here, at least in the sense that it often goes against EU trends and doesn't see engagement with China as risky as other EU or other Central and Eastern European countries. Still, even in the Hungarian case, I didn't really find evidence that economic relationship is positively affecting the political relationship, since Hungarian-Chinese political relations have been consistently good over the past, let's say, 2 decades, while China's economic presence is still not significant compared to, for instance, German or for instance, US presence. Taiwan is a different story. So while for the Chinese political ties seems to be very important, as I've just mentioned, rather than vice versa, I couldn't really find evidence of political factors affecting the location decisions of Taiwanese companies in Central and Eastern Europe. In fact, Taiwanese companies seems to make such decisions based on other criteria. Especially big Taiwanese multinational companies act in a highly pragmatic manner, which means that they do not really take account of political relations, but focus purely on their business interests. It also means that if they receive more investment incentives in Hungary, they choose that over Czechia, even if the latter is politically more friendly than the former. Another interesting link was revealed by the interviews, that is, the majority of big Taiwanese multinational companies with a presence in Central and Eastern Europe have a connection to China, either a subsidy on the mainland or cooperation at the global level. But the point is that these Taiwanese companies are leveraging these contacts and tend to locate where other Chinese companies are located. Similarly, since Taiwanese multinationals do not want to risk their already existing relations with Chinese multinationals, it seems that they are keeping a low profile in Central and Eastern Europe and do not emphasize or even hide their Taiwanese-ness. Consequently, I couldn't really find evidence of economic interactions affecting diplomatic relations between Taiwan and Central and Eastern Europe. There are some signs recently as a result of the shift of Lithuania towards Taiwan, which can be a counter argument of those results I have so far, but at least based on those interviews I've made, these are the major results of the research, and probably I stop here and wait for the questions later to come.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sunomura. Those are really fascinating dynamics, and we'll dig into them more in the commentary and Q&A. Dr. Huang, would you like to present next?
Okay, sure. I'm going to share my screen. Should be this one, I think. Okay, it seems to be fine, right? Okay, good. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'm very happy to participate in this STEAMSON event and share with you our study of foreign investment from Taiwan's high-tech sector and its impact. Okay, this work is part of the research project Economic Impact of Engagement with Taiwan and China, funded by the Global Engagement Center of the US Department of State and managed by the Institute for World and Peace Reporting. So GEC and IWPR's critical support is highly appreciated. My chapter target the country with a significant real-world trade and investment with Taiwan, especially in the field of high-tech. We identify two representative subsectors, the electronic manufacturing service, EMS, and the semiconductor foundry service, for which Taiwan has dominating market shares. In particular, the investment from the EMS subsector has been a driving force for the economic development of the CEE region. The top five global EMS players are Foxconn or Hon Hai, Pegatron, Quanta, Campbell, and Winston are all Taiwanese companies, with a combined revenue accounting for about 70% of the global revenue for the industry. And Foxconn, known for making iPhones for Apple, alone has annual revenue of $190 billion US. The industry provide electronic product a wide range of services, from product assembly to global supply chain management. In the past, most manufacturing activity has been taking place in China, the world's factory. However, as the business development evolved, multinational enterprises follow a trend from so-called offshoring to nearshoring, which considers many factors beyond labor cost, such as energy and utility, logistic and infrastructure, and the business environment, etc. Based on this particular index, the Czech Republic and Hungary ranked first and second among EU members in 2020. And the workforce competitiveness and the proximity to European market are crucial for their investment attractiveness. Foxconn made the first move in year 2000, as NS just mentioned, in the Czech Republic. 3 years of investment, Foxconn has built its the EMEA, Europe, the Middle East, and the Africa Regional Operation Center. In 2015, Foxconn further signed an MOU with the Czech government and promised an investment of about $160 million US by 2018, focusing on a partnership to promote the Industry 4.0 applications, data centers, and the RD centers. Foxconn thus has expanded its core investment in CEE region from manufacturing activities to operations and businesses based on technology and innovation. However, as NS just mentioned, that the formal relationship between Taiwan and the Czech Republic, as well with other CEE countries, was not a decisive factor. Actually, around the same time, the Czech Republic and China has the best relationship, including the bilateral visit by presidents. But anyway, more recently, Foxconn has become the second largest exporter of the Czech Republic, only after Skoda. And Foxconn's rising revenue in the CEE countries are summarized in this figure. In addition, as highlighted in an interview with a Czech union leader, the jobs created by Taiwanese companies is 8 times more than Chinese companies. Another important development for the global strategy of the EMS industry is related to the intensification of the US-China trade war starting from 2018. Many multinational enterprises have accelerated relocating production capacity in China to Southeast Asia and South Asia, the focus area of Taiwan's new southbound policy. For Taiwan's outward investment in 2010, the shares of China and ASEAN were about 84% versus 6%. However, for 2021, the shares of China and ASEAN were 32 versus 31%, almost the same. For the other representative subsector, the semiconductor industry has been referred to as the Silicon Shield for Taiwan. As highlighted in this figure, foundry companies are central to the ecosystem. The leading company, TSMC, with a global market share of 55%, has been making ICs for Apple, AMD, NVIDIA, Qualcomm, Broadcom, and many other famous companies without the semiconductor manufacturing facilities. The foundry business model is gaining more ground as the rising complexity, the physical limitations, and the cost increase of the advanced manufacturing process has put the integrated device manufacturers, IDMs like Intel's, in a very challenging situation. As the local cluster in Taiwan has been highly efficient, the foreign investment of Taiwanese semiconductor companies in the past were limited, many including one in Washington State, the US, and 4 in China. The recent investment plans of TSMC in Arizona, the US, and Kyushu, Japan have drawn global attention and will facilitate the growth of the associated semiconductor cluster. An investment in Europe is also possible after several issues are carefully examined, according to TSMC's formal statement. First, customers' demand must be foreseeable, at least for 5 to 10 years. In addition, a good local semiconductor cluster is required to keep up operational efficiency. And finally, the tax rates, various components of fixed costs that need to be reduced, probably through incentive programs. So for the findings, implications, and the conclusions, to support the global expansion of Taiwanese high-tech sector and hopefully relate it with Taiwan's foreign relationship development, the policy of the Taiwanese government and the strategy of the private sectors has to be aligned to adapt to the evolving business environment. And this approach is fundamentally different from what China has been doing, a top-down process, a top-down approach utilizing the resources of the national agencies, state-owned enterprises, and the many effectively controlled private companies. The partnership and the synergy between the Taiwanese government and the Taiwan's high-tech sector is a key to a win-win solution. And the possible actions may include the joint program to facilitate the technology cooperation and the transfer, and the bilateral cooperation on developing science-based industry parks. This will help realize the industry transformation in the CEE countries from manufacturing finished goods to developing and applying technologies. This will also help materialize the advantage of Taiwanese EMS companies in global competition. In addition, that the Taiwanese government can provide ODA resources to support the digital infrastructure in the CEE countries, which may lead to a more solid bilateral relationship when compared with the current trade and investment from private sectors. For the semiconductor industry, the governments of many countries have officially addressed the economic and the security concerns associated with supply chain interruptions. Meanwhile, the control regulating dual-use export has been tightened in many countries. Given this, and the extremely interactive semiconductor ecosystem, the Taiwanese government have to work with the foreign governments to better resolve the chip shortage crisis and to facilitate the establishment of a global semiconductor alliance. And Europe shouldn't be a missing piece. Thank you for your attention. So I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Dr. Huang. That was really interesting. Dr. Kuta, you've actually spent quite a bit of time examining Taiwan's relations with Central and Eastern Europe as well. So we'd like to get your feedback, your reflections on these two research reports.
Okay, thank you. So good evening, everyone. Good morning, everyone. So thank you so much for your invitation. I'm delighted to participate in this webinar on Taiwan and China's economic engagement in Central and Eastern Europe. So what I will do in the next few minutes is to give you my thoughts on the two chapters that were just presented a moment ago. I think it is extremely interesting to focus on this part of the world. Central and Eastern Europe are regions that have long been dominated by China, but in the past few years, we have seen dramatic changes in the bilateral relationship of some of these countries with Taiwan, with China, but I will go back to this in a few minutes. First, let me tell you that I enjoy reading the chapter of Dr. Agnes Sunoma even if I was a little bit surprised by the use of the one China principle. I think it was mentioned twice in the chapter, which is a denomination that is found in Beijing's narrative. On the other hand, I was not surprised by the main argument of the chapter, which is that economic engagements do not really affect diplomatic relations, in a sense that countries will not switch recognition from Beijing to Taipei because of Taiwanese investment. It is important here to keep in mind that those countries, the countries that we are talking about, do have differences. I know that in Western Europe, and probably even more in the United States or in Asia, we tend to consider those countries to be all the same. But from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, we have diversity. Diversity in terms of the size of the country, the population, the economy, the political system, the culture, and the history. But even with those differences, and even if the situation is not the same in every country, we cannot deny that diplomatically, China is losing ground while Taiwan is making valuable gains in the region. Traditionally, Taiwan has been strongly involved diplomatically in the South Pacific, in Central America, in the Caribbean, but it is now increasing its influence among countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And what is remarkable, in my opinion, is that no one or very few people saw that coming. If you had told me just 3 years ago that official delegation from Czechia, from Slovakia would come to visit Taiwan, that new parliamentary friendship group would develop in the Baltic states, in Poland, in Slovenia, countries like Lithuania, Slovenia again, would plan to open representative offices in Taipei while allowing Taiwan's representative office to use the name Taiwan instead of Chinese Taipei, I would have said, no, that is just impossible. But it happened. And the question we should ask is why? So I'd like to highlight 3 factors that can help us answer that question. The first one has to do with China. And this is maybe something that is not present or not enough present in the chapter. And it has to do with the relative disappointment of many countries in the region with China's economic engagement. There were a lot of promises made when Beijing launched its 16+1 mechanism in 2012, later again with the Belt and Road Initiative. And now, 10 years later, many of these promises have not been fulfilled. And the initial excitement has turned into some kind of perplexity, disappointment, and even frustration. Beijing talked about a win-win situation, but it seems that China is making the best of the situation, while many of those countries have the feelings that they do not profit from this arrangement. So when it comes to Chinese engagement in Europe, the majority of Chinese investment still go to Western Europe. The importance of Central and Eastern Europe remains limited. The second factor that can help us understand the diplomatic change in the region is public opinion. The region has changed over the last 20 years. So we should not be surprised if diplomacy itself is also changing. We have to realize that we cannot conduct diplomacy today like we used to do it at the turn of the century. People involved in politics, in businesses, or just the people living in the big cities of those countries do have different expectations about how relations between states should be conducted. So those people from a younger generation, they have benefited from the European integration. They travel, they study abroad, and they consider that principles and values about human rights, freedom of expression, freedom of the internet, respect for democracy, for the environment, should be taken into consideration when dealing with other countries. And I think that Taiwan understands this better than China. The image of China in the region is not really good. And the disproportionate reactions of Chinese officials, such as making direct threats to people, including elected people who have any kind of contacts, relations, or showing sympathy for Taiwan, is deeply hurting China's image. Moreover, we had scandals associated with some Chinese project in the region, infrastructure project in the region. I'm thinking about the constructions of highways in Poland, in North Macedonia, have put China in a difficult situation when it comes to public opinion. And finally, the third factor is Taiwan. Taiwan is proactive and Taiwan is doing a good job in the region. Taipei can rely on very competent diplomats who are aware of the fact that diplomacy is changing, like I mentioned before. They understand that the lack of official recognition for Taiwan does not prevent them from conducting people's diplomacy and parliamentary diplomacy. The goal is not to push those countries to officially recognize Taiwan, but to raise public awareness about the Taiwan issue and reject Beijing's narrative on Taiwan. So there are diplomatic opportunities for Taiwan, and I would say that the general environment, the context, is calling for greater engagement of Taiwan with the region. I think I still have some time to say a few words about the second chapter. I will go quickly on this one because I'm not an economist, but I have to congratulate Dr. Huang for making this chapter interesting and easy to understand for someone like me. The author is talking about the new southbound policy, and he's presenting the new southbound policy in a positive light. I agree with him that Taiwanese investment have increased in South and Southeast Asia. And to go back to something I mentioned before when I was talking about people's diplomacy, we also have a growing numbers of students from these parts of the world who come to study in Taiwanese university. But I think it is still too early to call it a success. As I recall, one of the goals of the policy was to reduce Taiwan's exports to China. And it seems that this is not happening. We are still talking about 40% of Taiwan's exports going to China. And when we are talking about companies like Foxconn or TSMC, we are talking about economic giants, but also about economic assets for Taiwan. Previously, I talked about the context, the general environment that favors Taiwan. I could make here the exact same argument, looking at the trade war, the post-COVID era, calling for the transformation of supply chains, the disappointment with Chinese engagement. All of these tend to favor, again, Taiwan. So like for the first chapter, what I said about the first chapter, there are opportunities for Taiwan to increase its footprint in Central and Eastern Europe. I have to say that diplomatically, there are always a lot of expectation when economic giants make the decision to invest in foreign countries. And economic diplomacy is important for Taiwan, but it is an area where it has been difficult for Taipei to compete with Beijing. But I'm convinced that if Taiwan is able to target its investment and is able to make sure that local communities benefit from the investment of Taiwanese companies, Taipei will be able to capitalize on this economic engagement. And we should not underestimate, and I will finish my presentation here, we should not underestimate the changes that are taking place in Central and Eastern Europe at the moment. I don't know how long will it take for Beijing to realize it has to reset its regional policy, but in the meantime, Taipei should do whatever it takes to make the best of the current situation. It is certainly in the island's best interest to broaden and deepen its ties with democratic European partners to secure its position within the international community. So that's what I wanted to say about the different subjects discussed in those two chapters, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kuta, and we will get started on the question and answers. I wanted to ask the authors if you had any comments you would like to make after hearing Dr. Kuta's reflections.
Yeah, probably me, just briefly. So I absolutely agree with what Dr. Kuta just said about the potential that is there for the Taiwanese. But when I made the interviews, I kind of tried to ask similar questions from the representative of Taiwanese companies. And this is the twist of fate and the feature of democracy, that while Chinese companies follow its order and plans on where and in the case of Taiwan, the situation is different because there are no state-owned companies. Those are private companies that follow their own business interests. And even if it is not in line with Taipei's decision on, for instance, investing more than Czechia, but they go to Hungary because of the favorable investment environment and those subsidies the Hungarian government is paying for them. Yet, politically, the relations are the coldest.
Dr. Huang.
Yes, I would like to also to thank Gregory's summaries about 3 points which are very important. And but indeed that's even though it seems that there's a great opportunity for Taiwan to enhance the foreign relationship with CE countries. However, how to take advantage of economic investment or it still need a lot of subtle arrangement because after all, they are private companies, as Anna's mentioned, that they are responsible, they are by nature profit seeking. However, I think this does not mean there's nothing we can do about it. Government certainly have some rules for foreign investment. It is a lot more apparent for the semiconductor industries. I know the investment of TSMC in Japan and the US are highly political, even though no one can confirm it, but everybody can imagine it's highly political. But I think for the case of EMS or electronic manufacturing, Taiwanese government has been very careful about how to utilize the investment of the private sectors, because after all, that's if you do something bad, it will backfire to the next election in Taiwan. So I think we need very subtle arrangement, but we foresee because some good thing might happen in the future. Yeah, that's my short comment to your points. Yeah, thank you.
We do have some questions that sort of naturally follow on to those themes. I'll start with a question from Christopher Ash, who asks, ultimately, do Central European and Eastern European countries have more to gain from these relationships, do you think, with China or with Taiwan? He mentions recognizing that China does have a poor track record on investments and transparency, and making pledges, not following through. So can Taiwan offer a long-term competitive economic alternative to China? What are your thoughts on that question?
Well, I can start. It could, but this is not the same. So basically both Chinese as well as Taiwanese, as well as German, as well as US, as well as South Korean or Japanese companies are targeting the very from Eastern Europe, that is manufacturing assembly. So Central and Eastern European countries are so-called factory economies. We often say that China is the factory of the world. Central and Eastern Europe is a factory of Europe, which means that all those multinational companies with an investment in these countries try to use these countries as manufacturing hubs. And this is true for the Chinese, this is true for the Taiwanese. Based on my interview results, because of this reason, there is not much enthusiasm towards the Taiwanese either, since they are also just bringing manufacturing activities. So my interviewees, for instance, believe that if Taiwanese investment was introduced in sectors other than manufacturing and assembly, for instance, in high-tech development, that could have actually a positive spillover effect on political relations.
That does seem to follow along with Dr. Huang, your recommendation that Taiwan expand the digital infrastructure within the region.
Exactly.
Yes. Yes, I think so, because that, as I know, there's labor shortage issue in CE already, and a lot of foreign workers are imported to CE countries as well. Because so we have heard that there's a strong need for automation, like Industry 4.0, and that was solve the problems about labor shortage in CE country. And at the same time, will raise the technology level or the competitiveness of the electronic sectors in CE country as well. But certainly that cannot be done overnight. A lot of the investment is needed before we can transform the industry from manufacturing to technology oriented. And we know there are some programs launched between, for example, Czech Republic and Taiwan. However, I think that's not enough. We need a lot of more, and so we can help to transform the value of the industry from a relatively low value industry to a value added industry. Yeah.
Any reflection, Dr. Kuta?
Yes, I just wanted to say that one of the problem of the Chinese is the lack of the benefit for the local communities, and has to do with the disappointment in many countries in the region. If Taiwan wants to do something different, it has to think about local communities, and it has to provide different kind of job. I think we just mentioned manufacturing job. That will be not enough. The workforce in those countries, those young people in those countries, they are well educated, and Taiwanese companies should try to provide a challenging position for those young people. And I think if Taiwanese companies are able to do so, they will be able to benefit from their engagement, and in fine, diplomatically, Taiwan will benefit from the cooperation between Taiwanese companies and the people in those countries.
Thank you. I'd like to follow on with a question from Dave Brown for, I think, Dr. Huang. If Taiwanese companies make their decisions based on primarily economic factors like subsidies, to what extent have you found that the Taiwanese government has been able to influence corporate investment decisions? Is there any case study you'd like to point out of government influence in these economic decisions, or is this largely private sector driven? You're muted, sorry.
Okay. There have been some example in the past which lead to serious failure in some, for example, in the Pacific or in the South America. That's the government try to encourage private sector to make investment in the countries with diplomatic tie with Taiwan. However, those the investment decision did not turn out to good return for the companies. So of course, there are multiple factors associated. We cannot make a conclusion that's because it was political, so it led to a failure. But so nowadays, that I think Taiwanese government has been very careful about making similar decisions or try to influence private sector to make investment in certain countries. But we have economic offices in different countries. They will try to help a Taiwanese company to facilitate their business in foreign countries. However, I really cannot cite some good cases or good examples that the successful story was based on the government's influence. And as I mentioned earlier, we know the investment of TSMC in Japan and in the US should be quite political, but as I say, I have no position. No one is going to confirm that. But I want to make a point over here is that making an investment is not only about profit. For the case of the TSMC's investment in the US, people has been talking about the production cost is much higher than that TSMC is going to lose money. However, as emphasized many times by TSMC, they are a service industry. They help companies to transform their R&D into commercial values. So making a close relationship with the customers, making a production site near to the customer is kind of a way to improve their customer service. So it cannot purely judged based on what is the production cost in Taiwan, what is the production cost in the US. And I think TSMC certainly take that into account. Somehow they need to please their big customers in the US. So I think there's a mixing effect over here. So I think nothing is going to no decision is going to make a purely business or purely based on political considerations. That's for the case in Taiwan. Yeah.
That's an excellent point. It is ultimately about market access, which leads nicely to our next question. I'm sure it's on everyone's mind how the crisis in Ukraine will have ripple effects in so many different areas of life all across Europe, considering the tragedy that is ongoing. Elizabeth Wishnick asks, she notes that Taiwan has been a strong supporter of Ukraine, while China has been seen to be backing Russia. So given the strong support for Ukraine across the Central and Eastern European region, with the exception of Hungary and Serbia, will this influence Taiwan and China's relative economic positions in the region, perhaps, or will these economic and institutional factors ultimately prove more decisive? I know it's still early days, the crisis is ongoing, but I'd like your impressions, your thoughts of where this might go.
Well, my answer is briefly, no, not at all, to be honest. So the majority central, which means that it will stay as it is. There are even coming investments. When it comes to Taiwan, as I've mentioned, political issues, diplomatic stay as well. And since they got to those support subsidy from the Hungarian government, I think that it is more than enough for them to not to deal with the Ukraine crisis as well. So I don't think that it will affect anything. I would just jump into the previous question briefly. So it is not just about locating in Hungary because tax incentives and subsidies are here instead of Poland, where, for instance, subsidies are lower. Taipei could say at least that I can give you some extra subsidy so as it will be in balance. But it is not just about subsidies and incentives. It's about Taiwanese companies acting patriotically, representing Taipei in, for instance, Central and Eastern Europe would inevitably affect their relations to their Chinese counterparts on the global and lose way more than the Taipei government could retaliate.
Dr. Huang?
For Elizabeth's question over here, because it's still really in a very early stage for the case of Ukraine, but what was mentioned was correct, that people in Taiwan has been friendly and care much about the situation in Ukraine. And thus, certainly the visibility of the countries has been much raised in Taiwan. So there's a potential interaction in the future, maybe in terms of trade, but in terms of investment, I'm not that sure. But I want to highlight one thing before the war, before the Russians invasion. That's if you have a look at the slide I showed earlier, that the nearshoring index, Ukraine actually has a very good performance. It is a very good location for production in terms of combining all of the factors. But the war certainly will destroy a lot of things. So, but the reconstruction could be an issue, and I expect that Taiwan will be interested in the reconstruction of Ukraine, and Taiwan is an observer for EBRD. So there's a platform ready over there, even though hopefully that's a full membership, but not at this moment. But I think just share a little bit more about what has been observed in Taiwan. Most of the discussion is more about, is Taiwan going to be the second Ukraine? So that's people has been making this kind of analogy, even though the government officially would debate or would try to explain what's the really difference over here. So I'm not sure. I know very little about this issue, but the issue over here. But I think I foresee that there might be more interaction between the two countries. I mean, Ukraine and Taiwan in the future. Yeah. Just very short comment over here.
Thank you. I think that is a good assessment. Dr. Kuta, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think people in Taiwan, they follow closely what is going on in Ukraine, especially for security reasons. And this alone could be the subject of another conference or discussion. I just want to go back to the relationship between China and Russia, because I think especially in the West, we fantasize a lot about how deep is this relationship. It is a very complicated relationship, always have been. China is a great power, and China will do whatever it takes to secure its national interests. So whether it is supporting Russia or not supporting Russia. I think for the consequences in Europe and in Eastern Europe, it's not going to help China's image in the region, especially among the younger generation. And if the situation continue, I think it could be a problem for China in its relationship, not only with the countries in the region, but all the country within Europe. And I mentioned before quickly in my presentation that the situation is not great between those countries and China. And I think in the coming years, China could also have some important issues, diplomatic issues with Western Europe and the European Union. So China has to be very careful when dealing with Russia. But like I say, Beijing will be motivated by securing its national interest. That's the motivation of all the great powers.
Thank you. We have time for, I think, one more question. So I will ask the question from Joseph Bullock, who wonders whether European nations are hesitant to accept direct investments from China because of China's history with economic espionage. And this has been a problem plaguing the United States for a while, issues with technology transfers, intellectual property protection. So is that a concern in Central and Eastern Europe as well?
Well, the question is about European nations in general. Of course, it depends on which European nation we talk about, but in the Central and Eastern European region, majority of the investments are greenfield investments because we do not have really big and nice companies to sell to the Chinese. So those greenfield projects are usually relatively well received because they are creating jobs and do not really harm any intellectual property right interests, for instance. There are some mergers and acquisitions in the region, but for those, we don't really have any effect on. So for instance, there's a chemical company, a chemical giant located in Hungary, Borsodchem, which used to be a state of Cold War era, but it has been privatized in the 90s to UK companies or US companies, and those companies decided to sell it to the Chinese. So it is a huge acquisition happened in Hungary with a company that employs thousands of people. Yet the Hungarian government, even if it wanted to say anything about the deal itself, wouldn't really have the opportunity to do that because it has been owned by foreign companies. So if it's an acquisition, no matter if European nations or Central European nations have any concern because of the potential security reasons. And when it comes to other investments, those are generally greenfield projects. So they are just creating a factory and manufacturing something there. And that basically comes without any risk attached.
Dr. Huang, have you found that to be the case similarly in your research?
I haven't got a chance to investigate this issue about the direct hesitant to accept the investment. So, but that's I think, but that's the case for US. I think that's quite apparent. That's why that's part of the US-China trade war. I think, yeah.
very true. I would like to ask for final comments so that we don't run too far over the hour. I know it is very late in Taiwan, so thank you for joining this evening. Final comments, let's start with Dr. Huang, and then we'll go to Dr. Sunamar, Dr. Kuta.
Okay. Well, that's my study has been conducted more from the aspect of the private sectors. So the decisions, the analysis are following the business logics. But on the other hand, I try to relate it with the key theme of the project about how we develop Taiwan's international relationship. But at this moment, that's I think, as I show in the final slides, that there are some opportunities or possible approaches. However, that's all of them need a lot of effort and a very subtle arrangement. And I think that's internally that we still have a lot of work to do. So as to make use of the 3 points mentioned by Gregory. But I'm positive about the relationship development for Taiwan with the Europe as well with Japan and the US. And so that it's to me, it's a starting point of this issue. That the study is actually a starting point only. Yeah, thank you.
Briefly, so if Taipei would ever wish to translate its economic links into then it has to find Taiwanese multinationals to act, we can call it patriotically, even at the expense of Taiwan-China corporate relations, because it seems to be the first step they have to take in order to have more diplomatic gains in the region.
Thank you, Dr. Sunamar. Dr. Kuta?
Just want to say that the book is relevant because I really think that we are, the context is extremely interesting, and in my opinion, things are changing in the region. And if I may just offer one point about the question just before about Europe's position against Chinese investment, I just want to say that times have changed, and in the perceptions of the people, but also perceptions of the government, perception of the business community, finally has changed in Europe. It has taken much more time than in the United States, but finally, I think we can call the end of European naivety when it comes to Chinese investment or Chinese economic interest in Europe. And I know Europeans love to criticize Donald Trump and the Trump administration, but many things that were said in a very bad way or commented by Donald Trump himself, many people in Europe share the same opinion. And I think now in the coming years, we will not go back to the situation in the 1990s or the early 2000s. I think that those times are gone, definitely.
Thank you so much, all three, for your fascinating comments and insights. I think this is a really important topic, how China and Taiwan engage in Central and Eastern Europe will become increasingly important as we continue to see supply chains diversifying and as we watch the dynamics play out between economic and political engagement, especially as Taiwan tries to leverage its engagement in other regions of the world, recognizing the importance of gaining as many friends as possible. So I think it'll be really important for scholars and just the folks out there in the audience alike to keep an eye on these dynamics. Thank you so much for joining us today for the enlightening discussion. To the audience, thank you for watching, and please keep an eye out. We will share a link to the report when it is published so that you can take a look and see all the really fascinating research and look at those graphs again. Dr. Sunamar, Dr. Huang, Dr. Kuta, thank you very much. And this